4 minutes. That's the entire window investigators still cannot account for. 3:23 in the afternoon, the last independently confirmed sighting of Nolan Wells on Horn Island. 4:27, the last moment his location can still be tied to something solid. 4 minutes later, at 4:31, GPS data confirms the boat he arrived on pulled away from the island without him. Everything this case has become, the autopsies, the federal arrests, the audio nobody can agree on, all of it orbits a gap that lasted less time than this sentence took you to read. This week, the organization that spent days searching those exact waters for Nolan released 22 pages on what they found trying to close that gap. And what they're actually saying is very different from what half the internet is claiming they said. If you want the version of this case built on what was actually confirmed instead of what performs well online, this is why Case Desk exists. Hit subscribe now, because tonight we're going through a report that's already being misquoted by channels bigger than this one, and we're going to show you exactly where the misquoting starts. Here's where we left off. Nolan Xavier Wells, 18 years old, went to Horn Island on the 4th of July with a group of friends from Ocean Springs he'd known most of his life. At some point that afternoon, according to that friend group, he chose to stay behind with a young woman he'd met earlier in the day. His friends left without him. His body was found 2 days later off the island's northwestern tip. In the weeks since, his best friend and his father have separately said, on the record, that staying behind isn't something Nolan would do. A viral emergency call to a private towing company has been picked apart phrase by phrase. An independent autopsy came back undetermined, with key neck structures withheld by the state and never given to the family's own examiner. No one has been charged in Nolan's death. A grand jury still hasn't convened. That's where things stood before this week. Now, the new report. The United Cajun Navy is a volunteer search and rescue organization, and it was directly involved in the search for Nolan on and around Horn Island in the days after he went missing. This week, they released a 22-page document they're calling a working analytical report, built from public information, GPS data from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, and photos, screenshots, and tips submitted by their own followers. That's an important detail to hold on to, because it shapes everything that follows. This isn't a law enforcement finding, it isn't a forensic conclusion. It's a compilation assembled by people with real operational knowledge of those waters, of everything the public has sent them. Brian Trasher, the organization's vice president, has been direct about what the report is and isn't. He's said plainly that it isn't meant to point fingers or draw conclusions, and that the goal was simply to organize everything they'd received into one digestible document. He's acknowledged that people are reading very different things into it. Some think there's real new information in there, others don't. He said that himself, on the record, and it matters, because in the day since this report went public, a version of it has been circulating online that sounds much more definitive than what the organization actually wrote. Here's what the report actually documents. It lays out a working timeline of July 4th, starting before 3:23 in the afternoon and running into the evening. It maps the boats connected to the case and where they were positioned relative to each other. And it lands on the same window we opened with tonight, the stretch between the last confirmed sighting of Nolan and the moment the boat he arrived on pulled away without him. The report itself calls that gap potentially critical to the investigation, not resolved, not explained. Critical, meaning unanswered, meaning exactly the kind of hole that a grand jury with subpoena power is built to fill. One detail in the report is easy to miss and shouldn't be. The organization notes there's no roster confirming who was actually on each boat that day. Read that again. More than a month into national coverage, after federal arrests, after 2 autopsies, after a Senate-level advocacy campaign from the NAP, nobody, including the volunteer group that searched those waters directly, can say with certainty who was physically on which vessel. That's not a small gap in the paperwork. That's the foundation everything else in this case is trying to get built on top of. The report does include new photographs. Ones the organization says show the 3 boats anchored together off Horn Island that day. Those images were obtained and published by TMZ. They haven't been independently authenticated by an outside source, and the report is careful to frame them as submitted material rather than verified evidence. There's also a specific new witness account inside the report worth naming directly, because it's one of the few details that's actually attributed to a real person instead of an anonymous tip. A woman named Caitlin Brochard has said she photographed the cluster of boats and that when her own group left the island around 7:30 that evening, Nolan was nowhere in sight. That's a real name, a real timestamp, a specific claim. It's also just one account among many the report gathered, and it covers a moment nearly 3 hours after the gap investigators actually care about. Now here's where this gets complicated, and where you need to be skeptical of anyone telling you this story simply. In the day since the report came out, claims have spread online that the United Cajun Navy definitively concluded there's no evidence Nolan was alive after that boat left, essentially branding the friend group's entire account as false. That is not what the organization said. Go back to Trasher's own words. Not meant to point fingers, not meant to draw conclusions. A report built largely from unverified tips and social media submissions cannot simultaneously be humble about its own limitations and also be treated as a definitive verdict on whether specific named teenagers are telling the truth about the last hours of their friend's life. Those two things cannot both be accurate, and right now, a lot of what's spreading online is choosing the version that gets more views over the version the organization actually published. That distinction isn't a technicality. It's the difference between fairly reporting an open investigative gap and effectively accusing a group of 18 and 19-year-olds of being complicit in a friend's death without a single piece of confirmed evidence to support it. We're not going to make that leap here, and if a channel you're watching does make it, that's worth noticing. There's a separate story circulating alongside all of this that deserves to be addressed directly, because it's actively making the investigation harder. A toxicology report claiming to show what substances were in Nolan's system at the time of his death has been circulating across social media for days. Attorney Ben Crump has confirmed that report is fraudulent. It did not come from either the state examiner or the family's independent pathologist, and its numbers don't match anything either office has actually released, because neither office has released toxicology results at all. Crump has said publicly that Nolan and his family deserve better than a fabricated document being passed around as if it's real evidence. If you've seen that report shared anywhere, it is not authentic, and repeating its numbers as fact only adds more noise to a case that already has more speculation in it than confirmed information. There's one more piece of this report worth walking through carefully, because it shows exactly how fast an unverified tip can collapse once someone with direct knowledge actually responds to it. Buried in the material submitted to the organization was a second-hand account describing a group fight on the island around 5 in the afternoon, with someone claiming a passenger of theirs felt certain Nolan was involved. Within hours of that account circulating, someone who says they were actually on the boat being referenced responded directly online, stating it was a different young man entirely, with no connection to Nolan, and describing him as having a bottle of alcohol in his hand at the time. We're not naming anyone involved in that exchange because none of it has been verified by investigators, and amplifying names attached to an unconfirmed social media dispute isn't reporting, it's just adding another rumor to a case that already has too many. What matters here isn't who said what to whom. What matters is that a piece of second-hand evidence offered as support for Nolan being seen alive well after the boat left was challenged within hours by someone claiming first-hand knowledge of that exact moment. That's the pattern this entire case keeps falling into. A claim spreads, someone closer to the actual moment pushes back, and the truth ends up sitting somewhere in between, unresolved, waiting for someone with subpoena power to sort it out properly. That same tension shows up in a separate claim from an attorney representing Bart Edmiston, the friend whose boat radioed for help that afternoon. His attorney has said at least 2 people saw Nolan on Horn Island roughly an hour and a half after both boats departed. Those 2 witnesses haven't been publicly named, and they haven't spoken for themselves anywhere on the record. That claim now sits in direct tension with a report that couldn't find solid evidence supporting Nolan's presence on the island after the boat left. Both cannot be fully correct at the same time. Either investigators will eventually corroborate what those unnamed witnesses reportedly saw, or that claim will turn out to be describing something else entirely, the same way the 5 o'clock account apparently was. We're not resolving that tonight, because nobody outside of investigators currently can. There's also a photographic thread connecting the hours before the boat left. Earlier reporting identified video, time-stamped at roughly 2:23 that afternoon, showing a young man in trunks matching what Nolan was photographed wearing earlier in the day, apparently aboard a different boat entirely. That places someone matching his description on the water before the 4:31 departure. After that point, despite an island packed with hundreds of people documenting the entire afternoon on their phones, no photograph, video, or social media post has been publicly confirmed to show Nolan there. That absence isn't proof of anything on its own. Islands full of people don't guarantee constant documentation of any one person, but it is a specific, real gap in the visual record, and it's exactly the kind of detail investigators reviewing every piece of submitted footage are positioned to either close or confirm. Let's go back to what is actually solid, because there's more of it than the noise around this report would suggest. The friend group's core account has held consistently since the beginning. 2 of Nolan's friends, Trayston Shepard and Warren Hudson, have said independently and on camera that Nolan chose to stay behind with a young woman he'd met that day, planning to catch a later ride. That consistency is real, and it's worth respecting. But 2 people who knew Nolan far longer than a single afternoon have pushed back hard against that account. Javon Williams, Nolan's best friend, who was actually on Horn Island that day, has said he's never known Nolan to separate from a group he arrived with, not once, not ever. Nolan's father, Elmore Wansley, independently said almost the same thing, describing it as a value the family specifically taught him growing up. Neither of them witnessed the actual moment Nolan is said to have stayed behind. What they're offering is a character-based doubt, built on years of pattern, not an eyewitness contradiction. That distinction still matters, and we're not going to drop it just because a new report adds more pressure to one side of this story. The emergency call remains just as contested as it was before this report came out. Nolan's friends called a private towing company, not the Coast Guard, around 4 in the afternoon, describing a bilge pump failure and a boat taking on water with 7 people aboard. That recording was released by the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, so every word of it is a matter of public record, not a leak. Weeks later, an enhanced version of that same recording began circulating, with claims that background voices could be heard asking whether someone was dead and telling someone to check a chest. A digital forensics expert who compared the enhanced file to the original found it ran 20 seconds longer, carried a different digital signature, and could not corroborate a single one of those phrases. He's also been honest that once you're told what to listen for, your brain will often manufacture it, whether it's actually there or not. No agency and no independent forensics authority has verified either version. That audio remains exactly what it was before this new report, unresolved and treated by responsible reporting as unresolved. The autopsy picture hasn't changed either, and it's still the most substantive piece of this case. The Mississippi State Medical Examiner completed its report weeks ago, and under standard county procedure for any death that isn't clearly natural, it's being held until it can be presented to a grand jury. The family commissioned their own independent autopsy, performed by Dr. Roger Mitchell, a former chief medical examiner and the current president of the National Medical Association. His findings, read aloud by Ben Crump at a news conference in Chicago, listed cause and manner of death as undetermined. He documented red discoloration in the soft tissue at the back of Nolan's head without being able to determine what caused it. He noted there were no lacerations, no fractures, and no deep tissue injuries anywhere on the body that he could identify, which matters just as much as what he did find. And critically, he wrote that key structures in Nolan's neck were retained by the state during the first autopsy and never provided to him, meaning he could not rule out a neck injury as a contributing factor and could not rule out that some non-accidental factor played a role in Nolan's death. That's not a conclusion that something happened. It's a statement that the exam wasn't complete enough to rule it out either way, from the one doctor the family was able to bring in. Since Nolan's death, threats have escalated against people connected to this case, and that part of the story has moved into federal court on its own track, separate entirely from the question of how Nolan died. A man in California was arrested and charged with sending threatening messages to a Jackson County judge whose son was among the friends on Horn Island that day. A second man in Illinois was arrested for threatening other witnesses directly, including sending one of them their own home address. Neither of those arrests has anything to do with Nolan's death itself. Nobody has been charged in that. It's worth repeating because it's easy to lose in a case with this many moving pieces. As of tonight, no one has been charged with a crime related to how Nolan Wells died, and the grand jury that will ultimately review everything, the sealed state autopsy, the independent findings, the emergency call, and now this new report, still hasn't convened. This case has also drawn support at a scale most local stories never see. The NOC passed a national resolution calling on state and federal authorities, including the Department of Justice, to conduct a transparent review of how Nolan came to be left on that island. Reward money has climbed into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, funded by a mix of civil rights figures, entertainers, and athletes, all of it explicitly conditioned on an arrest and conviction if a crime is ultimately proven to have occurred, not offered as a declaration that one already has been. On the other side, members of the friend group have launched their own public fundraising effort describing months of death threats, defamation, and being unable to attend their best friend's funeral because of ongoing safety concerns. The page states the group has cooperated fully with investigators and provided an extensive number of witnesses to account for their whereabouts that day. That specific claim, like almost everything else in this case, isn't something the public can verify independently. It's the kind of statement that either holds up once a grand jury compares it against phone records and GPS data that exist outside of anyone's personal account, or it doesn't, and no amount of public reaction in either direction changes what that comparison will eventually show. Both of those things, the reward money and the friend group's fundraiser, are real, active, and happening at the same time, which tells you something about how divided public opinion on this case has become, and how much financial and reputational weight is now riding on whatever the grand jury eventually decides. It's also worth remembering that the young men named on that page are the same age Nolan was. Whatever position you land on regarding what happened that afternoon, that's a detail worth holding on to before drawing any conclusion about any of them. So here's where this actually leaves us tonight. A 4-minute window that nobody, not the sheriff's department, not the family's attorney, not a volunteer search organization with direct knowledge of those waters, has been able to close. A 22-page report that its own authors describe as a compilation, not a verdict, being treated online as far more conclusive than the people who wrote it ever claimed it to be. A fraudulent toxicology report spreading faster than the real one is being released. An emergency call that remains exactly as contested as the day it surfaced. An independent autopsy that couldn't rule out injury to a part of the body it was never allowed to examine. And two people who knew Nolan best, his father and his closest friend, still saying the accepted version of that afternoon doesn't match the person they knew. Nolan's mother, Christine Wells Wansley, has said one thing consistently since the first week of July, through every autopsy, every report, and every wave of online speculation. She's asked that anyone with real information come forward, that any demonstration held in her son's name stay peaceful, and that the focus remain on finding out what actually happened to him rather than on anything else this case has generated along the way. Every new document that surfaces, including this one, gets measured against that same standard in this coverage. Does it answer her question, or does it just add volume? None of these threads prove what happened to Nolan Wells. That's still true tonight, exactly as it's been true every time we've come back to this case. What's changed is how much more evidence now exists without answering the one question that actually matters, and how much faster misinformation is spreading around it than the facts themselves are. A report meant to organize information responsibly is already being twisted into something its own authors explicitly said it wasn't. That should tell you something about where the temperature on this case is heading as it gets closer to a grand jury. We're going to keep tracking this the same way we always have, fact by fact, correcting the record when it needs correcting, and refusing to turn an open investigative gap into a verdict just because a verdict gets more attention. If that's the kind of coverage you want more of, make sure you're subscribed to Case Desk and leave a like on this video so this version of the story reaches more people than the one currently spreading without any of these corrections attached to it. The moment that report reaches a grand jury, or the moment anyone closer to this case goes on the record with something new, we'll be back with exactly what it says and exactly what it doesn't.